Sea wolves. 3 hours before dawn, 25 naked men crouched and shivered in the blasted heath of Barangooba, an island off the south coast of New South Wales. The massive granite plinths of Gurrawal, the whale, and Nurunga, the shark, loomed against the black sky, and the sea wolves howled. Wedge-tailed shearwaters blundered through the heath, colliding with the men who, locked in darkness, had no idea what spirits were assailing them. And they were spirits of Gardu, the ocean. Their voices began at 4 a.m, at first as tentative contact calls. Weku, Weku, I am here. So am I. Me too. Weku, Weku. Then they projected their voices in long, howling wails, an ancient ululation exactly like the howl of a wolf. A sound preparing the birds for their day coursing the crests of waves in hunt for small fish skipping and darting on the surface of Gardu. But first they had to gain momentum before launching themselves into the darkness. And collision with crouching Yuin men was the least of their concerns. They were seeking the wind's clear air and the cushion it provided between them and the ocean's surface. They glided and curved against that cushion for the entire day, and when they leave these shores in a few weeks' time, they will ride it for months. This was just 9 days ago, and I could see my son's head as he crouched in that heath, and I knew he had no idea what awaited him. But it was too late to wonder. He was about to become a man. I didn't cry. I did that the day before when I told him who he was in relation to the whale. When he was yet to be born, his parents stood in a cave above a Bass Strait bay, sheltering from the rain, and a rock appeared in the bay where none had been before. Barnacles crusted it, and the surge of Gardu swept over it, but suddenly it reared 8 metres above the waves and presented herself to us, Gurrawal, the whale. For 2 hours we watched that whale as she swam in a giant ellipse to the horizon and back into the shallows of the Parker River with her half-sized companion. She was teaching her calf to swim. I put my hand on the woman's belly and felt my son roll like a miniature leviathan. He was Gurrawal, and the day before the sea wolves moaned in the pre-dawn pitch, he received that name. No wonder I doubled over and tears sprang from my eyes. The great circle of the whale along the coast was complete. The old man behind me on that day had been initiated by a man whose father did not have an English name. Of course, the settlers shot that man and his wife and 40 others of his family. Only the boy remained, and he was taken by a man called Hammond, who had been involved in the incident. The son of that boy, Muns Hammond, lived to be 115 years of age, and so the men crouched in the heath of Barangooba last week received a cultural legacy handed down in an unbroken line from way before European occupation of this continent. I am related to that old man in the convoluted way typical of the massive disruption of Aboriginal families and the survival of so few since the colonial period, which means that most Aboriginal people on the south coast are descended from fewer than 60 or so individuals. Despite that disruption, however, the culture has survived and remembers all the incidents of dispossession. Australian Aboriginal culture has not been washed away by the tide of history, but remains vivid in black minds and acts as the locus for our lives. Australians pretend they have never met an Aboriginal person, despite Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders comprising 3% of the population. That means you only have to sit on a bench in Burke Street Mall or Martin Place for 10 minutes around midday on any given day, and roughly 300 people will pass you by, and 9 of those people will be Aboriginal. It's not that we are scarce, but that Australians do not recognise the Aboriginal face. Perhaps that face is unremarkable because a large number of Australians share it as a result of the absence of white women in the early years of colonisation. Australian educators pretend that they teach an accurate summary of Australian history, and yet the massacre of Aboriginal people in the war for possession of the soil is rarely mentioned, and the primary production of Aboriginal clans observed by almost all Australian explorers and their housing and tailoring is never mentioned. As Professor Sumner Miller used to ask on early Australian TV while advertising Cadbury's chocolate, why is it so? Waleed Ali, in last Friday's Age, wondered about Australia's vicious response to the most polite suggestion that Australia was invaded rather than settled. Intelligent people crumple their brains to construct sophist arguments to reassure Australia that it has an innocent, even heroic history. There was a war for possession of the soil. Aboriginal people lost it. Aboriginal people did engage in primary production and sophisticated government. Australia turned their back on it in the colonial era and deny it today. An inconvenient truth for a Christian country devoted to the idea of the Ten Commandments rather than their application to political life and private rumination. This history is incredibly close to us, not a remote and hazy confusion, but a real and palpable fact. We can still see the foundations of large houses burnt down as a routine policy by settlers anxious to gild their land grab with legitimacy. We can still see the massive canal systems cut through stone to farm eels. We can still see the dams built by Aboriginal people, even if we have to remove the extensions added by Europeans. We can still see the arms of ancient fish traps on tourist beaches, and we can still see the 4 pieces of the massive granite spire that proclaimed to the entire Bega Valley that Biami was looking over them. The history has not gone away, we just choose not to see it. When I was researching Convincing Ground and Dark Emu, I was told by senior historians that the primary document in the Australian history trove had been thoroughly examined. There was nothing new to be discovered. I wondered about that confidence as I sat in the State Library and cut the pages of a memoir which had never been opened. I wondered about the statement by contemporary historians that Aboriginal residents of Cape Otway numbered no more than 8, when a local resident informed me that his grandfather's letters and diaries remembered one of the massacres in the region, accounting for 20 Aboriginal lives. As a guide at Cape Otway Lighthouse, I was always delighted to talk with French, German, Italian and Vietnamese tourists. They could never believe Australia's accepted history and were hungry for information about the colonial war and Aboriginal culture. They needed it to make sense of the country. Australians, on the other hand, were jittery at the mere mention of the land war and scornful when shown the delicate stone tools of the Gadabarnid. One stone, and I hope it is still there, served as a needle sharpening device, a thread cutter and a measure. It is smaller than a matchbox, but serves a multitude of purposes. Overseas tourists understand its significance straight away, while many Australians express scorn. Just looks like a rock to me. Why didn't they invent the wheel? Perhaps the people who invented egalitarian government and practiced it for 70,000 years didn't have the imagination to devise a transportation device for cannons. Perhaps the people who invented bread were looking at life from a different perspective. 32,000 years ago, a woman collected a handful of seeds and looked at it. Maybe she lay awake that night pondering the potential of the little grains, but once she had confirmed her suspicions, she added water and heat to the flour and invented bread. It's probable that the invention is much older than 32,000 years, but we're not sure because we've only expended the intellectual effort to DNA test one grinding dish from Cuddy Springs 3 years ago. What we do know about that woman is that she conducted that alchemy 17,000 years before the next woman on earth tried it. That other woman lived in Egypt, where we still send our best and brightest archaeologists to investigate the pyramids, a task as important as one more critical text on Shakespeare's play Macbeth. Our best engineers are engaged in the construction of freeways and coal-fired power stations, which will never be built, while the 4 parts of the Biomunga mountain monolith still lay on the ground, where they fell after the explosion that paved the way for the ugly asbestos hut that houses a radio transmitter that was superseded 40 years ago. I dream of finding $1 million to airlift those pieces back into place so that Baiame might again declare his vision of peace for the entire southeastern corner of Australia. I dream of finding $4,000 to scrape the sand away from the Bermagui fish trap so that Aboriginal people could utilise its efficiency to secure their economic future. These are not big sums of money. They are dwarfed by the bribes Leighton Holdings paid to secure contracts in the oil fields of Iraq, a country our Prime Minister insisted had to be invaded because they had weapons of mass destruction. Afghanistan, Palestine, Sudan, Ethiopia, Georgia, the Amazon, Costa Rica could all use the pacification wrought by sensitive government based on fairness rather than religious bigotry or greed. Australia had that form of government and refuses to consider it for the peevish reason that it requires us to reflect on how we came to possess the soil. Those old Aboriginal people must have anguished over their social design. Here we are, in a fairly dry continent, they must have thought. How can we ensure that it provides sufficient food for us all? How can we ensure everyone has enough to eat, a house to live in, a system of care for the aged and handicapped, an educational system so that every child has an equal chance to learn about her world? I know those ideas are revolutionary and would be treated as some kind of whimsical communist plot, but they worked. The only firm basis on which to condemn them is to conclude that an elite minority deserve 1,000,000 times more food and wealth than the majority. I have visited the world's finest galleries and churches. I have sat beneath golden domes, walked between the gem-studded doors of grand mansions. I have walked slowly past the world's most famous art and pondered the swords, the boiling oil, the rack, the torture of infidels, the glorification of pedophile priests and kings, and never failed to be transported back to my own culture, where instead of men ruling the world with violence, woman is central to the whole of life, where men cannot begin to speak without saying the words, Bingajan Nalabergan, Nujan Jongorong. We arise from the mother's heartbeat. It's a declaration of the primacy of women. Instead of rampant lions and elephants, kings dripping in jewels and holding aloft golden swords, our people see the power brokers of the world as the blue wren and the emu wren. The Gunai people of East Gippsland play football with those 2 birds emblazoned on their jumper. Come on, the wrens. The Yuin see the black duck as pivotal to their life, gaze upon the representation of its form in Wallaga Lake and feel secure. There are depictions in Aboriginal art of the killer boomerang and the spear in association with imprecations about the importance of keeping the law, but the dominant images are incredibly gentle. A row of bats hanging from a tree to teach us about the importance of family. Fish and kangaroo to teach us about conservation. Beings floating in space with their legs folded back at the knee to impress upon us the importance of dream and the wonders it reveals. Our culture's reliance on agriculture is even displayed in the names we give ourselves. The people of the interior often gave themselves the name of Panara, or derivatives of that word, because it means grass. That is, we are the people who harvested grass seed. The Darug of Western Sydney called themselves after the name of the yam, the staple of their diet. Aboriginal song is crowded with the importance of preparing and sharing food. Women of the centre dance with a repeated action representing the broadcast of seed. Women south and east of the Great Dividing Range dance with their yam sticks. Young people today clamour to be allowed to join those dances. There was a time when the church and state repressed that cultural ambition, but it is alive today. And I attend every performance I can where the Judgewon dancers appear simply to see beautiful older women dance with 3 generations of their womenfolk. I have danced where the oldest participant was 83 and the youngest was 13. We danced for the shark, the black duck, the whale and the lyrebird. As we entered at one cultural precinct last week, the clapsticks announced the arrival of every one of the 29 individuals. The lyrebird immediately repeated the sound and tempo perfectly, 29 times. All 29 of us burst into laughter, conjured by the irony of a bird honouring our culture. The lyrebird imitates other birds and animals, machines, cameras, whistling kettles, and passes those songs down to each generation. One lyrebird in the Macedon Ranges is still repeating the sound of a camera shutter, which it probably hasn't heard for 15 years. The lyrebird's default call is this. It has remembered the rituals of our old people and continues to entertain itself and prospective partners with that sound. On Goolagga Mountain, there's a lyrebird that has begun to hear that sound again and launches into its repetition every time it hears the sticks being played. It has a brother on Byamunga Mountain who does the same thing, seemingly delighted to hear again what it had previously had to guard as a cultural memory. Lyrebirds remember and respect our culture, even if most Australians do not. While I was writing this paper, I was aware of the nostalgia bordering on sorrow that I was tapping onto the board, and I can hear it now in my voice. But in reality, it is the mildest of griefs, because I must be amongst the most fortunate of men, if you consider the sorrow, misfortune and pain the majority of men on earth have to survive. But there is nostalgia, and there is grief nonetheless. Last week, on that island, I was teaching young men how to knap stone to make blades and chisels. Fortunately, none of them had any more knowledge than my sketchy skills, but we struggled away, compared techniques and results, and edged toward a method of some utility, and were conscious that beside us on the rock were remnants of stone manufacture, which must have been at least 200 years old, and were conscious, and some which we knew to be just 4 years old. We were on a vast granite slab which Yuin men had used over a longer time than any human construction on earth. We mused on the antiquity of this heritage, aware that we, no matter the relative crudeness of our craft, were continuing that. I left the men on the rock to retrieve a tool from the camp and was immediately transfixed by the activity there. A group of men were fashioning wooden implements with a mixture of stone and steel tools. One young man was teaching an even younger man some dance steps. 2 other men were cooking fish they'd caught off the rocks, and 2 old men reclined in the shade talking about the next stage of cultural teaching. Somewhere else a man was learning a song while another accompanied him on clapsticks he'd made himself. I didn't stop my progress through the camp, but I was shaken by the cultural pulse. The previous day I'd gone chasing my son so we could dive together to repeat a habit that we'd indulged for most of our lives, but when I couldn't find the cove where he was fishing with other Gurunji, I swam in the first likely bay and was joined by 2 seals who must have learned to associate men with fish. It was a glorious and tranquil swim, and I left the water refreshed but pensive. I trudged back along a grassy island lane, and at an intersection I met 4 other Gurunji who had been on to the far side of the island to inspect cultural sites. We looked at each other and became still, each of us conscious of our state. This must have been what it was always like. Men of a camp, because women never visited this island, engaged in the multifarious tasks of the cultural economy, meeting as they returned to camp. It seemed so natural, so ancient, even if one of the near-naked men wore a watch and another carried a plastic mask and snorkel and a nylon mesh bag full of shellfish. That mood of pensive wonder stayed with me for 5 days until I nearly stepped into the path of a car on Marimbula's main street on Easter Monday. It wasn't sadness, not even morbid nostalgia that had rendered me so insensible to the real world, but mere surprise at the quickness with which we could revert to the tempo of that old life. You might think that the practice of Stone Age skills might be less than useful in a world of computers, but it is the investigation of those old skills which teaches us more than the quaint technology of the past. We learnt about a living tempo and recognised elements of the cultural stories that were rooted in just that rhythm and the contemplation for which it allowed room. No page in any library can provide any comparable stimulation. Every morning on the island I woke at 4 a.m. to the sea wolves making contact with each other. Weku, weku, and knew that the old people had woken to the same sound at this time of the year, and some of the songs and words they had left us were designed to describe that eerie pre-dawn ritual, members of an avian clan greeting each other. This might sound mournful and tinged with grief, but really there was a kind of wild joy in the realisation that we were still able to enter that old and infinitely gentle culture. All the riches of the oldest human culture on earth is available to Australians. Very little of it is prohibited to the uninitiated or those of a different race. Most of it can become the reassuringly comfortable garb of every Australian. We're not inviting a second dispossession of our culture, but an awakening of the nation to the land itself. We can all love it and care for it. We can love and care for each other. This is not a return to Rousseauian gloom, but an awareness of our country and its needs and ours. We need non-Aboriginal Australians to love the land. We must not quell the impulse to see the bush and the beaches as any Australian's heritage, because without that identification to the soil, those questing souls remain restless and dangerous spirits, uncommitted to the protection of the continent. Any Australian can climb Gulaga Mountain and visit the 7 chapters of Yuin law. Women can walk to the summit if they wish, but men can go no higher than the gallery of granite tors. It is on the walk through those tors that the gentleness of Aboriginal culture is most apparent. You enter by the forms of Nyadi, the woman. You pass Tunku, the man, who is second, and then you pass the pregnant woman, and it is culturally appropriate to rub her swollen belly. The next chapter is the baby being carried on its mother's back. Look at that child's eyes, and if you are a parent, allow yourself to be engulfed by the memory of your own child's birth. Where are the swords and war machines? Where are the gilded halls of selfish men? Where are the severed heads of people who disagreed with the king? On Gulaga Mountain, you are invited to rub the belly of a pregnant woman. I'm never failed to be moved by the gentleness of my culture. I never fail to wish that the directionless amongst the men of our people could muster the energy to climb the mountain barefooted to absorb the profound respect our old people had for women. This is not just a lesson for Aboriginal men, but men across the planet. Do not climb the mountain if you want to revisit a quaint and forgotten culture, but if you want to complete a world without war and which sees women as the centre of civilisation, then that is the place to go, and you can be guided to it by you and men and women who share the lineage of those old people, who insisted that this was the destiny of humans and saw that story writ in stone. It will cost you less than a speeding fine. That gentleness extends beyond women to the land itself, and surely now we can see that respect and care for our soil and waters is in our own selfish interests. We can keep our computers, and for at least another 20 years we can keep our cars, but we can also contemplate the Murray River and the outlandish idea that is within our capacity to make sure there is water in it. We can contemplate the Biomunga granite spire and the petroglyphic Bible at Burrup Peninsula and realise that we can enjoy a rich standard of living and keep these representations of the human spirit at its profound and elegant best. You don't have to be Aboriginal to understand Burrup art or listen to the Seawolf Shearwaters, but it would serve you well to understand Aboriginal philosophy if you wanted to save them and the land on which they exist. We cannot leave such momentous decisions to the craven and vindictive Western Australian Premier or a legion of red and blue Prime Ministers, fascinated by the prospect of their own survival. We are the Australians. It is we who have the power, and the philosophy required to generate that power already exists in this land and is available to us should we decide to embrace it, rather than the swamis and gurus of India or the chanting and floating flowers of Buddhist temples. All you need to do is acknowledge its existence, and that, of course, is history. Thank you.